Martha and James Whitmore had been married for 47 years, sharing a life filled with quiet routines, neighborhood cookouts, and the aching silence left behind by their missing son. But when the FBI came knocking one morning with a decades-old DNA match, Martha discovered the horrifying truth. The man she had slept beside for nearly half a century hadn't just hidden a terrible secret. He had buried it in the woods, along with their only child. Martha Whitmore always believed her life had followed a simple, predictable path. She married James in the summer of 1976, in a quiet church ceremony surrounded by family and friends. They moved into a small house in Bangor, Maine, and raised their only child, Daniel. To their neighbors, they were the perfect American family, steady, modest, and loving. James worked as a structural engineer, while Martha stayed home, dedicating herself to raising Daniel and maintaining the household. They celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes, went on road trips during summer breaks, and spent snowy evenings playing board games around the fire. Life seemed whole, but on October 18, 1984, everything changed. Daniel, then 16, left for school in the morning and never returned. At first, Martha wasn't worried. He'd missed the bus before. Maybe he'd gone to a friend's house or gotten caught up at the library. But by nightfall, her worry grew into panic. James called the police, and by the next morning, missing posters were printed and nailed to telephone poles across town. Searches were organized. Volunteers combed the woods and riverbanks. The entire community rallied behind the Whitmores. But there was no trace of Daniel. The police interviewed classmates, neighbors, and teachers. Rumors began to swirl. Some said Daniel had been talking about running away. Others claimed he had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd. But there was no evidence of foul play and no clear direction for investigators. Days turned into weeks. The posters grew weather-worn and tattered. Then months passed, and eventually, the trail went cold. Martha was devastated. Her days became a blur of grief and numbness. She stopped gardening. She didn't sleep. She kept Daniel's room untouched, just as he had left it. His favorite records still stacked near the turntable, school books on the desk, a baseball glove hanging from the bedpost. Every time the phone rang, she hoped it was him. Every time she heard footsteps on the porch, she imagined his face. But Daniel never came home. James, on the other hand, reacted differently. He returned to work after 2 weeks and rarely spoke of their son. When Martha brought up Daniel, James would change the subject or leave the room. She assumed he was dealing with grief in his own way. She clung to him because he was all she had left, and he remained steady, if distant. Over time, they developed a routine again. Holidays passed quietly. Friends stopped asking about the case. Life slowly moved forward, though a permanent void lingered in the house. They never moved, never had another child. For Martha, it felt like part of her soul had been amputated and buried in some unknown place. Years turned into decades. By the time the 2000s rolled around, most people had forgotten Daniel's name. The case had long since been shelved at the Bangor Police Department. Martha still marked his birthday every year. She baked the same apple pie he used to request, lit a candle in front of his photo, and sat alone in the kitchen with tears in her eyes. James would give a nod, sometimes offer a quiet, "He'd be proud of you," and that was it. He never touched the pie. He never visited the grave marker. They'd installed at an empty plot in the cemetery. It was symbolic, a headstone for a boy with no body to the outside world. The Whitmores looked like any other aging couple. They celebrated their 25th anniversary with a modest dinner at home. They traveled to Canada once, took up puzzles, and attended church most Sundays. But beneath the surface, the weight of loss had calcified into silence. Martha never stopped wondering what really happened to Daniel. She sometimes had nightmares, vivid dreams where he stood at the edge of a forest, reaching out to her before disappearing into the shadows. She never voiced these dreams to James. She assumed he didn't want to talk about it. In 2023, they celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary. Friends sent cards. Neighbors dropped off flowers. Martha looked at James that night across the dinner table, his white hair neatly combed, his hands steady as he carved the roast. She thought about all they had shared, all they had endured. She still loved him, even though he felt further away than ever. He had been her anchor through grief, her partner through tragedy. She believed they had survived the worst that life could throw at them. But she was wrong. The worst hadn't come yet. It was quietly creeping through old case files and forensic databases. It was buried in memories James had tried to forget. And it was coming, with flashing lights and federal agents, to the doorstep of their quiet little home. Martha didn't know it yet, but everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her son, and her life was about to be shattered. In early 2024, the FBI launched a nationwide initiative to review cold cases involving missing minors. With advancements in forensic genealogy and DNA technology, investigators were revisiting old evidence with fresh eyes. One of the cases flagged by the system was that of Daniel Whitmore. Though over 40 years had passed since his disappearance, a preserved toothbrush and a sealed envelope from his belongings had been stored in an evidence locker at the Bangor Police Department. A technician, working through a backlog of unsolved files, submitted the samples for modern DNA profiling. What followed would change everything. Several weeks later, a partial DNA match was discovered in a federal database. It belonged to unidentified remains recovered in 1985 from a wooded area near Kingston, New York. The case had been listed under John Doe 231 and had remained unsolved for decades. The remains showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, but without identification or suspects. They had simply become another forgotten tragedy. The body was buried in an unmarked grave, and the report filed away. But now, with a familial DNA link to Daniel Whitmore, the case took on new urgency. The FBI exhumed the remains and conducted a full DNA match using the latest techniques. The confirmation was shocking. The John Doe from New York was indeed Daniel Whitmore. After 4 decades, he had finally been found. But the mystery was far from over. The location of the body, over 300 miles from Bangor, raised immediate questions. How had Daniel ended up there? Why had he never been linked to that location before? And what exactly had happened in the final hours of his life? Agents began tracing anything they could find related to Daniel's last known movements. They pulled school attendance records, old interviews, and logs from the original missing persons case. Among the forgotten details was a police report filed by a gas station employee near Kingston in October 1984, the same week Daniel went missing. The witness claimed to have seen a teenage boy arguing with an older man next to a blue Dodge. The boy seemed upset. The man was trying to force him into the car. But without a missing persons match at the time, the report was filed and never followed up. Now, the color and model of the car matched a vehicle James Whitmore had owned during that time, a 1982 Dodge Diplomat. Investigators obtained old DMV records, confirming the car's registration to James in 1984. The vehicle had been sold years later and eventually scrapped, making it impossible to examine now. Still, the link raised eyebrows. James had always claimed to have been on a work trip during the week Daniel vanished. But when the FBI dug deeper, inconsistencies appeared. Travel logs from James's former engineering firm revealed that he had submitted expenses for a 3-day trip to Albany, a trip that overlapped with Daniel's disappearance. The documents showed mileage that lined up with a round trip from Bangor to Kingston. When pressed, the firm's retired secretary remembered that James had left in a hurry that week, more anxious than usual. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the FBI to take a closer look at him. Martha, completely unaware of any of this, continued her daily routine. She still kept Daniel's room mostly untouched. She still baked the pie on his birthday. She still sat beside James every evening watching the news. Not knowing the same bureau he once praised for catching terrorists was now quietly investigating him. The agents assigned to the case kept their operation discreet. They didn't want to alert James before they had something solid. They obtained a warrant to access his financial records, retirement funds, and any old property transactions. That's when they uncovered something unusual: a small, inherited property listed under James's name in upstate New York. It had never been mentioned in the original police investigation, likely because it wasn't connected to his Bangor address. The cabin had once belonged to James's uncle, passed down quietly after his death. James had never sold it, but it had been unoccupied for years. A quiet visit to the property revealed a decaying wooden structure surrounded by overgrown brush. Inside, the air was thick with mold and dust. The furniture was covered with tarps. In a locked storage space beneath the floorboards, agents found a rusted shovel and what appeared to be a tarp stained with old, dried blood. Forensics later confirmed the blood belonged to Daniel Whitmore. It was the break they needed. Though James had never been considered a suspect before, the evidence now painted a chilling possibility. The proximity of Daniel's remains to the cabin, the car matching witness descriptions, the lies in James's travel history, the cabin's location, his silence, and the blood-stained shovel. It was all pointing to one man. After 40 years of questions, the FBI was preparing to deliver answers. But the person who needed those answers the most, Martha, had no idea her life was about to be turned inside out. James Whitmore moved through life like a man untouched by the past. He maintained a careful rhythm: morning walks around the block, weekly grocery runs, polite chats with neighbors. To anyone watching, he was simply an aging retiree, well-liked and well-behaved. But as the FBI continued to unravel the truth, the illusion of normalcy began to crack. The surveillance team assigned to James watched closely, documenting his routines. They tapped his phone, monitored his computer, and discreetly followed him during errands. But James didn't lead them to any new evidence. He didn't seem nervous, didn't speak of Daniel, and didn't once break the rhythm he'd built. Over the years, he was either innocent or terrifyingly calm. The agents began looking deeper into his life. They pulled records from the 1980s, examined his old calendars, tax files, travel logs, and credit card bills. It wasn't easy. James had lived carefully. There were no arrests, no sudden financial changes, no hidden bank accounts. But then came a key moment: an interview with a woman named Evelyn Knox, a former co-worker of James from the late 80s. She recalled one conversation during a late-night shift at the engineering firm, where James, in a rare moment of vulnerability, mentioned that he had done something that tore his family apart. At the time, she assumed it meant infidelity or a financial mistake. But in the context of what the FBI was now discovering, her memory took on chilling new meaning. The agents pressed forward. They requested satellite scans of the abandoned cabin from past decades, hoping for aerial evidence. Nothing visible had been captured during the time of Daniel's death, but they did find something recent: when James had last visited the property in 1997, just before officially retiring. Why he went back remained unclear. The logs showed a 2-day stay, with no financial activity during that time. It was just James, alone in the woods, 20 miles from where his son's body had been buried. The implication was impossible to ignore. As the FBI built their case, they consulted with behavioral analysts. The conclusion was unanimous. If James had indeed killed Daniel, it was likely in a moment of intense conflict, not premeditated. But what followed, the cover-up, the silence, the decades of deception, was deliberate. It required calculation. It required detachment. And it required someone capable of living a double life. Still, all of the evidence remained circumstantial. There was no video, No eyewitness placing James at the scene of the crime, and no confession. But then the agents returned to the shovel recovered from the cabin. New techniques in forensic science revealed partial prints, worn down by age, but still viable. One of the prints matched Daniel. Another matched James. That changed everything. The presence of both father and son's prints on the same weapon, coupled with Daniel's blood on the tarp, was enough to move forward. The agents secured an arrest warrant. The time had come that it was a gray Thursday morning when the FBI knocked on the Whitmore's door. Martha was folding laundry. She heard the doorbell and opened it to find two agents in black jackets and a local officer behind them. They asked for James. She called for him, confused. When he stepped into the hallway, the lead agent identified himself and read the warrant aloud. Martha barely understood what was being said. James stood still, silent, as they handcuffed him. There was no resistance, no words, no explanation. Martha stood frozen in the hallway, her hands clutching a towel, watching her husband of 47 years being led out the front door in chains. News of the arrest spread quickly. Neighbors were stunned. Some didn't believe it. Others whispered that they always found James a bit too quiet, too distant. Martha didn't speak to reporters. She didn't answer calls from family. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her. The same chair James had occupied every evening since Daniel disappeared at the FBI field office. James remained calm during questioning. When shown the evidence, DNA, the shovel, the witness report, he offered no emotion. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He simply sat there, breathing slowly, his face blank. Then, after hours of silence, he spoke. He said it had been an accident. He didn't mean for Daniel to die. They had argued. Daniel wanted to leave home, said he hated everything, said he'd forged documents and planned to disappear. James snapped. He struck him. Then again, when Daniel collapsed, James said he panicked. He didn't call for help. Instead, he put the body in the trunk of his car, drove to the cabin, and buried him deep in the woods. He never told Martha. He never told anyone that he built his entire life around forgetting. And it worked for a while. But now, the truth had surfaced. 40 years later, the lie had finally caught up. The man Martha loved, the man she trusted, was a killer. James Whitmore's confession sent shockwaves through the small community of Bangor and across the country. The story was picked up by national media outlets, who ran headlines about the mild-mannered retiree who had hidden the murder of his own son for over 4 decades. Reporters camped outside the Whitmore house, camera crews lined the street, and old acquaintances came out of the woodwork, offering their stunned recollections of James and Martha. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone had a theory. But no one could explain how a father could kill his son, lie about it, and live a quiet, peaceful life beside the grieving mother for nearly 50 years. The prosecution built their case carefully. Despite the passage of time, the evidence was powerful. The DNA matched to the remains. The shovel with both sets of fingerprints. The bloodstained tarp from the cabin. The falsified travel records from James's engineering firm. And now, the recorded confession. He had detailed the argument, described Daniel's rebellious plans, and admitted to the fatal blows. He didn't try to justify the act. He didn't even cry. When asked why he had never told Martha, James simply said, she wouldn't have survived it. Martha, however, was very much alive, and now trapped in a reality she didn't understand. She refused to speak to James after the arrest. She did not visit him in jail. She didn't send letters. She canceled their shared bank accounts, took down every photograph of them together, and boxed up his belongings. Her world had collapsed, not just from the grief of knowing Daniel had been murdered, but from the deeper, more paralyzing realization that the man who held her hand at the funeral vigil, who hugged her every time she broke down, who comforted her with silence and steady presence, that man had committed the crime. He hadn't just lied. He had destroyed her life with purpose and precision, then calmly sat beside her as she unraveled over the years. She couldn't find words for the betrayal. There were none big enough. The trial began in early spring. James appeared in court in a gray suit, thinner than before, his hair almost completely white. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like someone's grandfather. But the courtroom buzzed with tension as the details were laid out. Forensic experts testified about the condition of the remains and the timeline of death. Behavioral analysts explained how a person could compartmentalize guilt for decades. The medical examiner described the trauma to Daniel's skull. A retired police officer who had worked the original missing persons case testified about how there was never any suspicion toward James because of how convincing and composed he had been. Martha did not attend the first few days, but when the time came for the victim impact statement, she walked into the courtroom, her face lined with grief and rage, her hands trembling. She stood before the judge and described the 40 years she spent searching, grieving, and praying. She spoke of the birthdays, the holidays, the constant ache in her chest. She spoke of Daniel's empty room and the countless nights she cried into her pillow. She spoke of James's coldness, which she had once mistaken for strength. And then she said what shocked everyone. She wanted James to live, not to be executed, not to be forgotten. She wanted him to sit in a prison cell for the rest of his life, and to wake up every morning with nothing but silence, knowing exactly what he had done. The judge sentenced James to 25 years in prison, the maximum for his age and the charges. It was essentially a life sentence. He showed no reaction as the verdict was read. He simply nodded and allowed the officers to escort him back to his cell. After the sentencing, Martha disappeared from public view. She put the house up for sale and quietly moved to a small town in Vermont under a different name. She wanted no media, no interviews, no visitors. She left behind nearly everything: possessions, friends, memories. All that remained was a small box containing Daniel's belongings and the ashes of what could have been a beautiful life. For her, the past was no longer a source of comfort. It was a lie, carefully constructed by the man she trusted most. She filed for divorce a week after the sentencing. The process was swift. There was no dispute, no contest. The final papers were mailed to the correctional facility where James would live out the rest of his life. Martha never opened the confirmation envelope. She placed it in the same box with Daniel's childhood items, locked it, and placed it on a shelf she no longer looked at. The world eventually moved on. The media coverage faded. New headlines replaced the old. But for Martha, the damage remained. There was no justice that could restore her years, no closure strong enough to erase the lies. She had been married for 47 years, and never once did she suspect the horrifying truth. Her life had been stolen from her in silence. And now, all that remained was the echo of a son's laughter she could no longer hear, and the hollow shadow of the man she thought she loved. James Whitmore spent his final years inside a federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania, his life reduced to a narrow cell, cold meals, and the silence of a man with no visitors. He rarely spoke, rarely wrote, and refused all interviews. Some inmates called him the engineer, unaware of his past. Others, who had read about his case in the papers, kept their distance. There were no altercations, no complaints. He was, as he had always been, quiet and calculating. He never asked about Martha. He never mentioned Daniel. To the prison staff, he was just another aging convict counting down the days in isolation. Meanwhile, Martha was learning to exist again. She rented a small home at the edge of a quiet town in Vermont, where no one knew her name and no one asked questions. She took up gardening again, not because it brought her peace, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. The grief still lingered, but it no longer defined her. What weighed heavier was the betrayal. 47 years of marriage, A lifetime of shared memories, and every one of them now felt like a lie wrapped in kindness. She often questioned herself more than she questioned James. How had she not known? How could she have shared a bed, a life, with someone capable of such cruelty? She would stare at photos of them smiling together and feel a sickness in her stomach. She kept Daniel close in small ways. His photo sat on the mantel, and she wore the same silver bracelet he gave her on her birthday in 1982. She made his favorite apple pie every October and brought a slice to the local shelter where she had started volunteering. The teens reminded her of Daniel, full of confusion and fire, desperate to be understood. She never told them her story. To them, she was just Ms. Martha, the kind woman with soft hands and a faraway look in her eyes. One afternoon in late spring, she received a letter in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a short note written in James's handwriting. It read, "You were the only good thing in my life. I'm sorry. I was afraid of losing everything. But I lost you anyway." There was no name, no explanation, and no request for forgiveness. Just those words. She read them once, then tore the letter into tiny pieces and fed them to the fire. She felt nothing. Not anger, not sorrow, just emptiness. It was too late for apologies. The time for truth had passed long ago, several months. Later, James died in prison of heart failure. No one claimed the body. The prison arranged a quiet cremation and placed his ashes in a numbered container in their storage vault. Martha was notified by letter, but she chose not to respond. There would be no burial, no service, no obituary. He had already buried himself. The moment he chose to bury their son, Daniel, however, did not remain forgotten. With permission from authorities, Martha had his remains transferred from the unmarked New York grave to a cemetery in Vermont. A proper headstone was erected, etched with the words, "Daniel Whitmore, loved forever, lost too soon." The funeral was small, just her and a local pastor. But for the first time in over 4 decades, Daniel had a final resting place, and Martha had a place to visit that held both truth and peace. The story faded from public memory. Other crimes, fresher scandals, and newer tragedies took the spotlight. But in that quiet Vermont town, Martha lived on. She found solace in the mundane. Morning walks, knitting circles, library visits. Her laughter returned, softly at first, then more often. Not because she forgot, but because she refused to let grief be the only thing left of her. Sometimes, when the wind rustled the trees just right, or when she passed the high school at dismissal, she thought of Daniel. She imagined who he might have become: a teacher, a musician, a father. She let herself grieve those possibilities, but refused to drown in them. Life had stolen much from her, but it hadn't taken everything. Her strength remained. Her will endured. And in the quiet moments, she whispered her son's name, not with sorrow, but with love. That in the end, the truth had surfaced, brutal, bitter, and late. But it had come. Martha had lived 47 years beside a man who hid the darkest stuff, secrets, but she had survived it. The FBI had brought answers, but it was Martha who brought dignity back to Daniel's name. The past was forever altered, but the future, in its own small way, still belonged to her.